Hello, today we're going to talk about substance use disorders. In this section, we'll have a chance to take a look at what constitutes a substance use disorder and different categories of abused substances, including depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. As we begin our discussion of this section, I would like to ask you to think about what your reaction would be to knowing someone personally who has a substance use disorder. Perhaps they have a problem with alcohol or some other drugs. We do have a tendency to judge people who have problems with addiction and think that they are weak, they lack willpower. Don't they see what they're doing to themselves? Why can't they just stop? But what we'll see in our exploration of substance use disorders is that when someone becomes addicted to a substance, it alters the way their brain works and alters the way they think, feel, and behave. And while it is true that they are responsible for the choices they make, once they're caught up in the throes of addiction, they have lost personal control and very likely will not be able to break that cycle of addiction until they are able to get help for themselves. When somebody experiences a substance use disorder, they continue to use the substance even though it's causing problems in their life in one way or another. They may not really see that they have a problem, and they may be likely to blame other people or situational factors for their problem. They might have legal difficulties, financial difficulties, relationship conflict, health problems, financial problems associated with their substance use. And it tends to get worse over time. The kinds of drugs that are involved in substance use disorder are called psychoactive drugs because they affect our mental functioning and our behavior. All of the drugs of abuse have this one thing in common. They alter neurotransmitter activity in the brain in one way or another. That is the common pathway biologically for how drugs affect us, by altering neurotransmitter activity. Different drugs tend to affect different neurotransmitters. The categories of drugs of abuse include depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. We will be exploring all three of these categories. These drugs either stimulate, inhibit, or mimic activities of the brain's chemical messengers, that is, neurotransmitters. And the way people react to psychoactive drugs depends on a lot of different factors, including how they are affecting them biologically, what psychological influences the drugs may have on the person, and the cultural traditions involving the use of certain substances that a person is exposed to in their environment. When someone develops a substance use problem, oftentimes they experience tolerance, where they need more and more of the drug to produce the desired effect. And they may also experience withdrawal symptoms, which are very uncomfortable physical and psychological symptoms that occur when the person doesn't have access to a drug whose effects are wearing off. So we tend to use the words substance use disorder and addictive in an interchangeable kind of way. But as you can see, addiction itself is caused by increased intake of a psychoactive drug or by compulsive and dysfunctional behaviors associated with the use of that drug. This graph helps us to look at how tolerance develops. As you can see in the graph, once someone starts using a drug, they need increasing amounts of it to produce the desired effect. And when that happens, that's when tolerance has taken place. So in the beginning, they might get the effect they're looking for, say, with 1 can of beer. But after drinking for a while, now they need 3, 4, 5, or 6 cans of beer to produce that same desired effect. This table lists for us some of the criteria that are considered in determining whether or not a person has a substance use disorder. And as you can see from this table, once a person's substance use starts to control them, they begin to experience problems in one or more areas of their life. It can actually cause hazards to their safety and their health and that of other people. And they may experience both tolerance and withdrawal. So what is the process that leads to drug tolerance then? It's increasing use over a period of time where the person needs more and more of the drug to produce the desired effect. So these are the categories of drugs of abuse: depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. We're going to be talking about each one of these categories. As you can see, depressants reduce neural activity and slow bodily functions, while stimulants have the opposite effect. They excite neural activity and speed up body functions. And they also raise energy and self-confidence. And hallucinogens, also called psychedelic drugs, distort a person's perception of reality and trigger unusual sensory images in the absence of sensory input, like seeing or hearing things that aren't actually there, for example. So let's talk about the depressant drugs. There are 3 broad categories of drugs in the depressant category that we'll be looking at: alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates. There's another category of drugs that are considered depressants that are called benzodiazepines. They're not really talked about in this chapter, so we won't focus on them. They do come up, though, in the next chapter on therapy. We're all familiar with alcohol, and many people have used it and use it on an ongoing basis. Sometimes people might mistakenly think that alcohol is a stimulant, because when they have a certain amount to drink, they become less inhibited, say in a social situation, a party or something like that. Why would you suppose that happens? Well, it's because the alcohol as a depressant helps to decrease our level of anxiety that we might be experiencing in a social situation, and helps us to become more relaxed. After a certain amount of alcohol, we might, become more talkative and friendly and perhaps the life of the party. And if we have too much to drink, then we might very well make a fool out of ourselves and do things we later regret, because alcohol can impair our judgment. Alcohol can affect us physiologically in various ways. It can adversely affect our long-term memory by interfering with REM activity when we're sleeping. One way it can. Binge drinking can adversely affect the functioning of the brain, and drinking over time can actually cause memory impairment. It slows down the activity of our sympathetic nervous system, and it has a sedating and depressing effect on us and our nervous system. And when a person has way too much to drink, it can lead to alcohol poisoning and death because it shuts down the body's functioning when that happens. If someone experiences alcohol use disorder, they're going to show tolerance and withdrawal associated with their alcohol use, yet they continue to use even in the face of these problems that they may experience. Another term for alcohol use disorder, of course, is alcoholism. And it's been found that on college campuses, binge drinking is a serious problem in both males and females, and it takes less alcohol for a female to get drunk than a male. Why do you suppose that would be true? Their bodies are smaller and they metabolize the alcohol more quickly. Alcohol can cause damage to various organ systems in the body, including, of course, the brain, and cirrhosis of the liver is a condition associated with liver damage from alcohol abuse. In this slide, we see MRI scans of two women, one with alcohol use disorder and one without. And you'll notice in the scan on the left, there are larger empty spaces in the brain. Especially, you'll notice the ventricles in the center of the brain. They're much larger for the woman who has alcohol use disorder compared to the one who does not, indicating rather extensive brain damage, loss of neurons in the brain of the woman with alcohol use disorder. Another category of depressants is barbiturates, also referred to as tranquilizers. They're not used that much anymore. In the past, they were used a whole lot more in the treatment of things like anxiety and insomnia. Some examples are Nimbutal, Seconal, Amytal, and these drugs were found to be very lethal when taken as an overdose and also when combined with alcohol. So nowadays it's very rare that these drugs would be prescribed for a patient who's having problems with anxiety or insomnia. The third category of depressants is the opiates, and this includes drugs that are derived from the opium poppy. Morphine would be an example. Heroin is another example. And then there are various other pain medicines like OxyContin, oxycodone, that you're probably familiar with. And as you know, that we've had a serious problem in our society in recent years with opiate addiction and many people dying from overdoses of opiates, especially heroin and other drugs that are even more potent than heroin. These drugs affect endorphin activity in the brain, whereas the alcohol and the barbiturates affect the activity of the neurotransmitter GABA in the brain. So if somebody is addicted to opiates, there are various kinds of symptoms that you might see, like constricted pupils, slow breathing, lethargy. They have a gnawing craving for another fix. Their life revolves around that drug and they just can't get enough of it because it has such a powerful addictive effect on them when they use it. And they may experience intense withdrawal symptoms after building up tolerance for the drug when they don't have access to it. When a person uses opiates over and over again, their brain's natural endorphin producing capabilities decrease, so they rely on the opiate drugs more and more in order to experience pleasure, and they experience significant withdrawal symptoms when they don't have access to the opiates, placing them in a high risk situation for death by overdose. So an interesting question that's posed in our book is, can someone become addicted, quote unquote, to shopping? Alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates are all in a class of drugs called what? Depressants. The stimulants are another category of drugs that produce pretty much the opposite effect of the depressants. There are various drugs in the stimulant category, including caffeine, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines, and ecstasy, all in this category. You can see some of the physical effects. They produce dilation of the pupils, increase in heart and breathing rates, rise in blood sugar levels, leading to a loss of appetite, and also rise in energy and self-confidence. Nicotine, of course, is associated with smoking, a highly addictive drug. In fact, a while back, they did a survey with addictionologists, people who are experts in the field, and asked them to rank order substances in terms of their addictive power, and nicotine was up there at the top of the list. And if you've ever known anyone who has tried to stop smoking, you can appreciate what a powerful effect nicotine can have on our body and mind. Of course, nowadays, a controversial area has to do with vaping and people getting nicotine in that way. Cocaine is a powerful stimulant drug, and it increases a feeling of euphoria and pleasure rather intensely for people who use it. With both cocaine and also methamphetamine and amphetamine, it has been found that one of the ways in which these drugs affect us is by increasing the output of dopamine in our dopamine neurons in the brain's reward pleasure center. All of us experience pleasure from natural activities every day. A hug, a kiss, a beautiful sunset, a chocolate chip cookie, ice cream, beautiful music, many things can allow us to experience pleasure. And when we do, there's an increase in dopamine activity in our brain's reward pleasure center that's in the vicinity of the hypothalamus, although they're like different interconnected centers in our brain that have to do with the experiencing of pleasure. Well, once a person uses these drugs, the effects are so powerful they come to rely on the drugs in order to experience pleasure, and they deplete their brain's natural dopamine producing effects by kind of playing out the dopamine neurons, if you will, so they aren't able to put out dopamine in the natural way that our neurons do when we experience pleasure. So they come to rely on the drug in order to experience pleasure. And that is true for cocaine, also amphetamine, and methamphetamine. In this slide, we can see the mechanism of action when this happens for cocaine, where it blocks the reuptake of dopamine at the synaptic junction, as you can see there. So under the influence of cocaine, it can affect us in many different ways. We can become more aggressive. We can become suspicious. We can have various physical problems, including convulsions, cardiac arrest, and respiratory failure. And the psychological effects that cocaine has on us may depend on the dosage, the type of cocaine that's consumed, and the situation in which it occurs, and what the user expects of taking the cocaine. And that then interacts with their personality and can magnify certain personality traits in unhealthy ways. We mentioned before amphetamines and methamphetamines. Of course, amphetamines are legal prescribed drugs, although people take them illegally. And certainly, methamphetamine is an illegally produced drug that is a serious problem in many communities, and they both have similar effects on the brain in terms of how they impact dopamine neurons. Here we see a picture of a woman who's addicted to methamphetamine, and we're struck by how different she is 1.5 years later after starting the use of methamphetamine. you can see how this drug has had a very powerful negative effect on her body just by looking at her appearance. Another drug categorized in the stimulant category is ecstasy, also called MDMA. It also has some hallucinogenic effects as well, but it produces euphoria and a feeling of social intimacy, sometimes referred to as a party drug. And it does trigger the release of dopamine and also stored serotonin and blocks its reuptake to produce its effects. After about a half an hour, when the effects of ecstasy set in a social settings, people feel more intimately connected to the people around them. It's a false sense of intimacy. It's not real, but sometimes they go overboard in their expression of uh, intimate feelings and later regret it in those kinds of situations. It can be rather harmful to a person's physical health, causing dehydration, uh, and very short-term health risk and long-term harm to serotonin-producing neurons, to mood, and also to cognition, ecstasy. The final category of drugs is the hallucinogens. These are also called psychedelic drugs. And interestingly, they don't seem to have some of the same addictive properties as other drugs do, and that people may be less likely to build up tolerance to these drugs, but they definitely can have harmful effects on an individual who uses them. And even marijuana is considered a hallucinogen, a mild hallucinogen, and with that particular drug, its effects depend, as with drugs in general, on how long you've been using it, and how much of it you use, and how often you use it. So when somebody has a trip, as it's called, when they're on hallucinogens, it alters their perception of reality. It may begin with simple geometric forms, and then um, it may involve more complex, meaningful images that look distorted to the person, like a picture they might be viewing. And at the peak of the experience, individuals may feel separated from their bodies when they use hallucinogens. They can have flashbacks where they re-experience these sorts of perceptual disturbances when they're not taking the drug. And it can be rather scary. A common hallucinogen is LSD, which is produced in the laboratory, also called acid, and it seems to interfere with serotonin neurotransmitter functioning, and a person can experience a wide array of emotions under the influence of LSD, all the way from euphoria to detachment and even panic. And it seems to depend in part on what the person's mood and perceptions were before they actually took the drug. Back in the 60s, people were exploring the possible use of LSD to enhance the effects of psychotherapy. And lab researchers were actually giving the drug to each other and observing what effect it had. As you're probably aware, the active ingredient in marijuana is THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, that produces its psychoactive effects. And as you're well aware, marijuana is a very controversial drug in our society, with some states now allowing its recreational use, more states allowing its medical use. But the state laws and the federal laws about marijuana are often uh, not in sync with one another. So people sometimes say, well, why can't marijuana be legal? Because alcohol is, and look at all the problems alcohol can cause, and certainly can appreciate that argument. But marijuana has its own set of problems it can cause. As you can see here, using it frequently can create greater risk of anxiety, depression, and even addiction to the drug itself. It can also cause problems with concentration and memory, among others. So in comparing marijuana and alcohol, since people often will bring the two up and compare them, you can see there are some different effects here. Marijuana is similar to alcohol in that it can relax, disinhibit, impair motor and perceptual skills and reaction time. But THC and its byproducts linger in the body far more than a week. So it's in there longer than with alcohol. And also because of that, regular users may experience a less abrupt withdrawal. To say a little more about how marijuana may harm the brain and impair cognition, it can disrupt memory formation. Heavy usage over a long period of time can actually lead to shrinkage of brain areas that process memory and emotion. As you know, medical marijuana, it has now been legalized in a number of states and has been found to be helpful in the treatment of various conditions, including pain, nausea associated with diseases such as AIDS and cancer. This table helps us make a comparison of some of the drugs that we've been talking about. You'll find this in your textbook, and it's a helpful review of some of what we've been talking about. In completing this discussion, I would like to share with you this quote also found in your textbook about addiction. How strange would appear to be this thing that men call pleasure, and how curiously it is related to what is thought to be its opposite, pain. Whenever the one is found, the other follows up behind. Plato. So how does this pleasure-pain description apply to the repeated use of psychoactive drugs? That completes our discussion about psychoactive drugs in this PowerPoint. And next up, we'll be talking about mood disorders. Peace be with you.